My name is Jessica, and I worked as a night waitress at a small cafe in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's not a big city, but I like living there. I had taken the job at the cafe a few months ago because it paid decently and allowed me to focus on my art during the day. I was an aspiring artist trying to make a name for myself, and the flexible hours at the cafe suited me perfectly. I wasn't used to working night shifts, but I needed the hours to pay my bills. Plus, the hotel where the cafe was located was usually quiet, especially after 11 p.m. Most guests were either asleep in their rooms or out enjoying the nightlife. I felt comfortable working late. It gave me time to think about my art while I served coffee and snacks to the occasional guests. That night, everything started off as usual. I clocked in at 7 p.m. and put on my apron. The cafe was beginning to fill up with the late-night crowd. There was a small group of people scattered around, some businessmen sipping coffee and chatting, a couple of tourists discussing maps, and an older couple enjoying dessert. It was just another typical shift, and I was getting into the groove of things. As the clock inched closer to midnight, most guests had cleared out. I was getting ready to close up when a man walked into the cafe. At first glance, he didn't stand out much. He was tall, probably in his mid-40s, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. He wore an old, tattered jacket, and his jeans were dirty, which wasn't unusual for the area. Sometimes truck drivers or travelers would stop by the cafe on their way through town. But as he walked closer to the counter, I felt a wave of unease wash over me. He didn't greet me or say anything right away. Instead, he stood there, staring at the menu on the wall. His eyes darted back and forth, like he was reading, but not really absorbing anything. I felt a tension in the air, as if he was studying me, and it made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, he finally looked at me and asked, "Got any rooms available?" I told him he'd have to check with the front desk, which was in the lobby just down the hall. He didn't move right away. He kept staring at me, as if trying to figure something out. I felt a sudden urge to look away, so I focused on wiping down the counter in front of me. "Do you work here long?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah, a while," I replied, trying to keep my tone polite but short. I wanted to avoid eye contact, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. He didn't respond. Instead, he gave me a strange smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Without saying another word, he turned and walked out of the cafe. I watched him leave, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Something about him was just off, but I brushed it off and went back to cleaning. A few minutes later, I caught sight of him again through the large front windows of the cafe. He had checked in and was now standing on the second-floor balcony of the hotel, looking down at the street. What really caught my attention was that he was looking directly at me. Our eyes met for just a second, but I quickly turned away, pretending I hadn't seen him. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, convincing myself I was just overreacting. After all, I'd seen my fair share of odd hotel guests, but the fact that he was still staring at me from his room made it hard to focus. I told myself I was being paranoid and tried to return to work. By the time my shift ended at 2 a.m., The hotel was almost completely quiet. I grabbed my things, clocked out, and stepped outside, ready to walk the few blocks home like I always did. As I walked down the street, I glanced back at the hotel and saw him again, this time standing at the window of his room, still watching me. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace, trying not to make it obvious that I had noticed him again. I walked another block, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the empty street, but something kept pulling my attention back to the hotel. When I finally forced myself to glance back again, I saw him again. He wasn't at his window anymore. He was standing outside the hotel, watching me from the parking lot. Panic started to creep in. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that he was probably going for a smoke or something. But when he called out, "Hey, wait up," I froze. His voice echoed in the still night air. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, as I saw him walking toward me with that unsettling smile still on his face. "You heading home?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an undertone that made my skin crawl. "Yeah, I am," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's late, and I need to get some sleep." "You should come to my room," he said, as if it was the most natural suggestion in the world. "Have a drink, relax a bit." I shook my head quickly. "No thanks, I'm just heading home." He took another step closer, his smile fading slightly. "Come on, just for a bit. You look like you could use it." My instincts screamed at me to get away. "I really have to go," I said, taking a step back. His face darkened, and for the first time that night, I saw something more than just creepy vibes. His expression turned cold, almost predatory. "You're going to regret saying no," he said. That was when I knew this was more than just a weird encounter. This guy was dangerous. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I turned and hurried back toward the hotel, heading straight for the manager's office. My heart raced as I knocked on the door, hoping someone was still around. Thankfully, the night manager, Tom, was still there. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice shaking as I told him about the man and how he had followed me. Tom, who had always been calm under pressure, nodded and said he'd handle it. We went back into the lobby together, and sure enough, the man was now standing just outside the front doors, pacing back and forth. When Tom stepped outside to confront him, things escalated fast. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Tom said firmly. The man ignored him at first, continuing to pace like an animal trapped in a cage. Then, without warning, he lunged at Tom, throwing a wild punch. Tom managed to dodge it, but the man kept coming, swinging again and again. I screamed and ran back inside, grabbing the phone to call the police. I could hear the scuffle outside as Tom tried to fend him off, but it wasn't long before the other hotel staff came to help. By the time the police arrived, they had managed to pin the man to the ground, but he was still struggling and cursing under his breath. The cops cuffed him and led him away, but he didn't stop staring at me the whole time, his eyes burning with a twisted rage. As they put him in the back of the police car, he said something I'll never forget. "I'll find you." They asked me a few questions, took my statement, and then sent me home. After that night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that man's cold eyes and his threat. I worried that he might come after me, even though I didn't know who he was or why he had picked me. I started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder whenever I went out, especially at night. My art suffered because I couldn't concentrate. The fear hung over me like a dark cloud. Days turned into weeks, and I began to settle back into my routine. I told myself I was being silly and that I was safe now that the man was in jail. But one evening, I was sitting in my tiny apartment trying to paint when I heard a knock at the door. My heart raced as I froze, staring at the door. Who could it be at this hour? I didn't expect anyone. I slowly walked to the door, peeking through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a tall figure standing outside, partially hidden in the shadows. It was a man. I couldn't see his face, but something about his stance felt familiar. Panic surged through me. Was it him? I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Jessica," the voice called, low and smooth. "Open the door." I held my breath. It was him. I knew it was. He had found me. "I just want to talk," he said, sounding casual, but I could hear the underlying menace. "I'm not going to hurt you if you let me in." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What should I do? I could call the police, but what if he heard me? I had to think fast. "I'm not interested," I called back, trying to sound brave. "You need to leave." There was silence for a moment, then a chuckle. "You really think you can just ignore me?" he said, his tone shifting. "You can't run away from this, Jessica." I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke my name. How did he know it? "I'll always find you," he said softly. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang against the door. I jumped, my heart racing. "Let me in, Jessica. I'm not going away." I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the situation, my hands shaking. The man outside continued to pound on the door, his voice growing frantic. "You're only making this harder on yourself." I could hear him starting to yell, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay quiet. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and relief flooded through me. The man outside paused, his breathing heavy. "You think they can protect you? They can't help you," he shouted. Just then, the police arrived, and I could hear them outside my apartment door. "Police, open up!" one of the officers shouted. The pounding stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was my heart pounding in my ears. Then the man said, "I'll be back, Jessica." The officers forced the door open, and I rushed out to meet them, shaking and terrified. They quickly assessed the situation, and as I explained everything, they began to search the hallway. Thankfully, he was gone. The police took my statement, assuring me they would keep an eye on the area. They recommended I consider getting a restraining order. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a wave of relief mixed with fear. I was safe for now, but I knew this wasn't over. For weeks after that, I stayed alert, always checking my surroundings. I moved furniture in front of my windows and started using a security system. The memory of his threat echoed in my mind, haunting me every time I tried to sleep. Finally, one day, I received a phone call from the police. They had caught him again, this time for stalking, and they had evidence linking him to other incidents in the area. It brought a sense of relief knowing he wouldn't be around, but the damage was done. I had changed. Despite everything, I realized that I couldn't let fear control my life. I returned to the cafe, feeling stronger. The dark clouds began to lift as I focused on my art once again. I channeled my fear into my paintings, using the colors and strokes to express what I had endured. Through the trials and terror, I emerged determined to reclaim my life. The experience taught me resilience, and while I remained cautious, I refused to let my fears define me. The cafe became a sanctuary again, and as I poured coffee and chatted with regulars, I realized that the power to move forward rested within me. Something was seriously wrong with him. "Hey, do you need help?" I asked, taking a cautious step toward the man. I kept my flashlight pointed at his face, trying to see him clearly. He looked strange, almost off. For a moment, I thought he might be in trouble, but then something shifted in his expression. His grin widened unnaturally, and without warning, he bolted straight into the dark forest behind him. In 1 second, he was there, and the next, he was swallowed up by the shadows between the trees. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran to the spot where he had been standing, shining my light in every direction. Nothing. There was nothing at all, no sign of him, no sound of footsteps, no rustling leaves, just silence. The stillness around me felt eerie, like the forest was holding its breath. At this point, I was shaking. My instincts screamed at me to call it in, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? Some guy was laughing and pretending to choke, then ran into the woods. It sounded ridiculous, but there was something unsettling about the way he acted, the grin, the gestures. It was all too strange to just ignore. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my radio and called the local police. They instructed me to stay put and assured me they would send someone to check it out. I waited anxiously by my truck, nervously pacing and keeping my flashlight trained on the tree line, half expecting that man to come running back out at any moment. About 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. I told them everything I saw, trying my best to sound rational. I could tell they were skeptical, yet they nodded and started a sweep of the area. Together, we searched the campsite and the surrounding woods, but it felt like a wild goose chase. After about half an hour, one of the officers called me over. "Mike, you need to see this," he said urgently. I followed him deeper into the woods, my heart racing. Just a few yards into a small clearing, we found what looked like an abandoned campsite. An old, weather-beaten tent stood partially collapsed, and next to it was a circle of rocks forming a makeshift fire pit. But what caught my attention were the strange items scattered around. There were dolls, creepy, old-fashioned porcelain dolls. Their faces were cracked and faded, and they were arranged in a circle, all facing inward. Their lifeless eyes seemed to stare at something unseen. Near the center of the circle, half buried in the dirt, was a rusty knife. "This looks like someone's idea of a sick joke," one of the officers muttered, but I wasn't so sure. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if something was lurking in the shadows, watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that man grinning from behind a tree. The police searched the area thoroughly, but they never found any sign of him. No footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing. I even asked around afterward, talking to other rangers and some regular campers, but no one had seen or heard of anyone fitting that man's description. The campsite we found wasn't registered with the park, and the police couldn't trace the items back to anyone. It was as if that place had been forgotten, left to decay in the middle of the woods. I wish I could say I figured out who that man was, or why he was there, or even what those creepy items meant, but I never did. The park has been quiet ever since, and I've tried to push that night out of my mind. However, when I patrol the northern trails, I can't help but feel like someone is watching me from the trees. Sometimes I swear I can hear faint laughter in the distance. I'll never forget that man's face, the way he grinned, as if he knew something dark and twisted. Underscore 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 underscore. My name is Lauren, and I'm from Pennsylvania. I've worked at a small tech firm downtown for 3 years, mostly handling customer support and troubleshooting issues remotely. I don't have my own place yet, so I'm living with my younger sister, Kate. We've been sharing an old car that's been with us since college, but that night, she needed it to drive to her night class. I checked the weather that morning, and it wasn't supposed to rain, but Pennsylvania weather is unpredictable like that. I remember that night clearly, even though I've tried to forget it for months. It was a midweek night, around 9 o'clock. I was leaving the office late, having stayed to help close up after a small network outage that set us back. My phone was dead stupidly. I forgot to charge it at work, so I pulled up my hood and stepped out into the pouring rain. It wasn't a light drizzle. It was the kind of rain that soaked you through, no matter how quick you tried to walk. My apartment was about a 20-minute walk from the office, and under normal circumstances, it wasn't too bad of a stroll. But in the dark, with the rain making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, I felt exposed. The streets were quiet, unnervingly so. The downtown area can feel empty at night, especially after businesses close. Occasionally, a car would drive by, splashing through the puddles, but otherwise, I was alone with the sound of rain hitting the pavement. About halfway home, I turned down a side street. It was a shortcut I usually took during the day, a narrow, dimly lit road with small shops on either side. Most of the stores had already closed for the night, their windows dark. As I trudged through the rain, I noticed headlights approaching from behind me. I tried to move closer to the sidewalk, figuring it was just another passing car, but this one slowed down. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it was an old white car, the kind you'd see in cop shows from the 90s. The window rolled down, and a man, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" I immediately felt my stomach twist. Everything about him seemed off. His voice had a strange, forced friendliness to it. I couldn't make out much of his face through the rain, but I saw enough to know something didn't sit right with me. His hair was greasy, matted to his forehead, and there was a faint glow of a cigarette between his fingers. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, trying to quicken my pace. But he didn't move. The car stayed in place, creeping along at my walking speed. The guy leaned further out of the window. "Come on, it's pouring. Where are you headed?" "I'll get you there safe." I tried to stay calm, pretending like I didn't hear him. I glanced around, hoping to see someone else, anyone, but the street was deserted. The rain wasn't letting up, and every splash from the puddles felt like the world was closing in on me. My heart was pounding, but I kept walking, telling myself I was overreacting. Then the car stopped completely. The engine rumbled low, and I heard the creak of a door opening. I didn't dare turn around. My whole body went cold. Suddenly, there were footsteps, heavy and fast, splashing through the water. I heard him muttering something, though I couldn't make out the words through the rain. The sound of his boots hitting the ground grew louder and closer. In a split second, my fight or flight instincts kicked in. I bolted. I don't know how fast I was running, but I ran like my life depended on it, because at that moment, it truly felt like it did. I heard him yell behind me something unintelligible, and his footsteps quickened. I could hear the splashes getting louder and closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, scanning ahead for any signs of safety. Up ahead, I spotted the neon glow of a convenience store sign. It was still open, thank God. I burst through the doors, drenched from head to toe, and gasping for breath. The guy at the counter, a teenager no older than 17, looked at me like I was crazy. "Call the police," I gasped, my voice barely working. Someone tried to grab me. The kid fumbled for the phone while I ducked behind one of the aisles, trying to make myself small and shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how long it took, but it felt like an eternity before the flashing red and blue lights filled the store's windows. When the police arrived, they took my statement, but by then, the man and his car were gone. They searched the area, asking if I remembered anything about the guy or the car, but in my panic, I hadn't gotten the license plate. His features were too blurred by the rain for me to give a clear description. All I could say was that he felt off. The cops patrolled the area for the rest of the night, but they didn't find anything. They told me to stay alert and call them if I saw the guy again, but that didn't make me feel any better. How was I supposed to stay alert for someone who could be anyone? When I closed my eyes, I saw his car creeping alongside me, heard the squish of his boots in the puddles, felt his presence right behind me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. Whenever I walked home after dark, I would find myself glancing over my shoulder, jumping at every slow-moving car, every rustle in the bushes. I never saw him again. The police never found him. Who was he? Why did he target me? What would have happened if I hadn't run? These questions haunted me, especially the one I'll never know the answer to. Why did he just disappear? It was like he was a ghost, and the fear I felt that night was all too real. In time, I learned to cope. I took different routes home, avoided walking alone in the dark, and even invested in pepper spray just in case. But the memory of that night, the man's unsettling grin, the echo of his footsteps in the rain, stayed with me. The real monsters aren't always the ones you can explain. Sometimes they vanish into thin air, leaving you to wonder what could have happened. And as I continued to patrol the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that, in some dark corner of my mind, he was still watching, waiting for the right moment to reappear.